Hi there folks, happy Homebrew Wednesday. It's good to see you all again. I've got the follow-up parts of the videos from last week because the Melomel is now finished. It's churning away there rather well. It's very vigorous, presumably because as well as being made up of honey, the jam, which has an incredibly high sugar content, is quite happily. In fact, you may be able to hear it out. It may have been taken out because I do run a noise removal in the background of these videos to get rid of sounds like the central heating, the fan in the computer, and any other noise that's going on. But there's an incredibly high-pitched squeal coming off that, which is the carbon dioxide escaping, and incredibly vigorous reactions. I imagine that's because the sheer quantity of sugar combined with the yeast nutrient and all the orange peel fruit that's in there, all just working away and being consumed by the yeast. So we're probably going to end up with a pretty high alcohol yield on this, and as well as that, a very high residual sweetness, which will be great, and a fruity flavour because of the brambles and the oranges, which will just give it that extra little edge that I think was missing from the last one. It just didn't have that punch of extra fruit flavour. But before we get on to any more, I've got the video of me finishing the last little touches to that, so let's just segue into that. At the moment it's been about 40 hours since I put the pectolase into the meat to help break down the bramble jelly, and as you can see, everything's kind of mixed together and the jam has broken down, probably partly as a result of being mixed in with all that water for so long. But it's now at the perfect stage to start putting the yeast in and getting it going. So I have my yeast nutrient, which is really just an insurance policy because, as I said before, there should be enough in the skin of the oranges for the yeast to actually live off. But in the interests of not being too careful, I'm going to pop 1 teaspoon of the yeast nutrient in. And I'm going to add our VR21. The VR21 yeast, which I chose this one particularly because it's actually a red wine yeast, but I chose it because it's good for getting fruit flavours out and really pulling them out. So that was my general intention with this one. Obviously, when I made my last meat, which was the pure meat, I just used champagne yeast. So it's always a good idea to vary it depending on what exact fruit you're putting in, especially if you're dealing with something like a mead or a Melomel, which isn't your regular beer or wine. But yeah, also experimentation. There we go. So that's that in. Now the fun part. I get to shake this again. Just get the yeast mixed in. Now that it's shaken, we put our sterilised balloon on top. Now make sure you warm the balloon up. Always stretch and warm the balloon because you don't want it to burst. I do have a spare one in there just in case. Always a good idea. Yep, I had to go into the second balloon, the first one burst. It's a good idea to try and just get it on in one go, otherwise they break easier. Take your needle, pop it through 4 or 5 times, and that's you. Now remember, as before, put this in a warm place. Now if you're sensible, you'll reserve the little inside to check the starting gravity. Now, I generally find filling it up about a third of the way into the tube is the best way to start. That's sitting just about 1.0. So, write that down. Remember to label your mead, it's always a good idea, and then pop it somewhere nice and warm so that it's going to ferment. And that should get going in the next 3 or 4 hours. Being a Melomel, it's probably going to take it a month or 2 before it's actually ready to rack into secondary. Now, a couple of people have asked me why I use these plastic containers when I have demijohns sitting around. Now, the main reason is actually because you're putting so much fruit and so much extra stuff into the container that if you put it in a demijohn, it's a pain to get it back out again. Also, you're reducing the possibility of infection by using the water that's already pre-sterilised. So it just makes more sense to use these to begin with and then rack through to the other one. Which I'll get back to in a few months, or hopefully, if I'm really lucky, in a few weeks, once the fermentation has gone up and then died back down, and then we'll actually be able to take it from there. So as well as that, I've also got the video from last week where I originally racked and then bottled the Bramble wine. Now, I'll just rush through that quite quickly, but that all worked out rather well. Ended up with a quite high yield, as you'll see, a yield of bottles rather than a yield of alcohol. Ended up with 8 bottles in the end, but let's just watch that quickly. Right folks, it's been a couple of days. I've finally found the time to bottle the rest of the Bramble wine. As you can see, we've got about 4.5 litres of this. So I've set up, slightly just out of shot here, I actually have 8 bottles put aside for this just in case. I'm not expecting to get more than 6, but it's always a good idea just to be prepared, just in case of the eventuality that maybe you knock one off the table and you have to have another one lined up. So let's get on with this. As ever, everything's been sterilised to within an inch of its life. Well, we've ended up with 5 and just under half bottles of wine. Now this half bottle, of course, won't last too long. It'll be drunk quite quickly, and it's not easy to see. Obviously, the very end of it is where most of the sediment will go, so although it's not the clearest bottle, this being an old sherry bottle, you can quite see that that's not the clearest in there. Similarly, compare that with, for example, one of the first bottles, and you can see there's practically no sediment in there at all. Now, that's always going to happen. I mean, I racked this into a secondary to remove a huge amount of the sediment from the initial fermentation. You could have racked it again into a tertiary, but for the amount of sediment that's in it, it's not really entirely necessary, and all that's going to happen is every time you rack it, you're losing a small amount of the wine. So at this stage I'm quite happy if maybe there's a small amount of sediment in the bottom. It's perfectly natural, normal for wine. In the meantime, it's probably a good idea to start popping the lids on these. They're colour coded, makes it easier to remember. Now, with all wine, it's ideal if what you do is store the wine standing up for at least the first 3 or 4 days. There's actually a technical reason for that, which goes by interestingly by the name of bottle shock. Now, bottle shock is actually simply the reaction of having transported from one vessel to another, the inclusion of new oxygen into it, and potentially can leave, well, gives the possibility, if your wine isn't dry enough, or if there's some residual yeast left over, of there being further fermentation. Now, again, the best idea for that is to leave it for 3 days and then you tip it on its side, if you've corked it, to allow the cork to absorb a small amount of the wine and expand, locking it inside the bottle. Now, for these ones that are screwed on, and because this had an extraordinary high yield of alcohol, that's not really going to be an issue. Yeah, so it's been quite a busy week. It's been a busy couple of weeks. So hopefully I'll get a bit of a rest from quite so much, and hopefully we'll be able to chart the progress of the Melomel as it goes along. And in a couple of days, I imagine I'll be able to store the bottles on a rack, because as I believe I mentioned in the video, it's best to keep the bottles standing upright for the first couple of days, just to allow the sediment to sink to the bottom, and then you put it in the rack and just leave it for about a month. If possible, you don't have to, you can drink it more or less straight away, but it's a good idea to let everything settle to the bottom first. But you get what's called bottle shock, where the act of racking it into the bottle does have a slight effect on the flavour. There is an interesting point that comes up with homebrewing that I'd like to talk to you about today, and that's what to do with your home brew, because it's something that comes up a lot, I think, with people, because they don't realise the quantities that you're going to end up getting at the end of this. Now, I ended up with 9 bottles of I think it was 9 bottles of Melomel in the end, in total, and 9 bottles of mead from my previous one. So I'm expecting to get, that was beer bottles, that's 500ml beer bottles, so you do the math. I ended up, as I said, with 8 bottles of wine, and 750ml bottles of wine, and when I start doing beer, hopefully before Christmas, I might go on a little winter ale, but I'm going to end up with probably around 35 to 40 bottles of beer. Now, that's all fine and well if you want to do this just once in a while. If you have a constant running home brewing session like I do, and you really enjoy the actual making of the homebrew, sometimes a little bit more than the actual drinking of the homebrew. Not because there's anything wrong with it, just because, to be honest, I don't drink that much. And there's no way that I'm going to get through 40 bottles of beer in a month, which is your average sort of turnaround if you're making beer. With wine, thankfully, because I tend to make it from stuff that grows in the garden, I'm only going to make it now and again. I'm going to try possibly making some fruit wines just from juice, but we'll see about that. It probably won't be till next year. But in any event, you've got to do something with this. Now, a lot of people think, well, I'll sell it. Well, yeah, that's actually a lot more difficult than you think, because depending on what country you're in, there may be very high restrictions. Now, in the UK, you don't have much in the way of restrictions on homebrewing. You can homebrew as much as you want. So you end up with a situation where you've got people like me churning out masses and masses of it. Now, you're not allowed to sell it, because to sell alcohol, you have to have a license. And to have a license, you have to have a licensed premise to brew on. Not a licensed premise in terms of for selling alcohol, but you basically have to go through an awful lot of paperwork. It's not hugely expensive. It's a few £100s, but you have to go through the point, and then you have it checked. It has to be checked for sanitation, make sure that it's sanitation. You have to make sure that it's up to sanitary standards. That you then have to, your home then becomes taxable as a workplace, because you're obviously making something that you're then going to sell. So your home effectively turns into a production plant. You actually have to put up signs on the building stating that your home is a brewery. It's an awful lot of effort. So, what I tend to do is just give it away. I give away booze to people, or I get them round and get them to drink it when they're here. And that's really your best option. Now, some people say, oh, well, there's lots of friends of mine, but they'd quite happily buy it. Well, there's a great workaround with that. get them to buy the ingredients. If somebody comes up to you and says, "Ah, I could really use 40 bottles of beer," say to them, "Great. Get them to supply you 40 beer bottles." It's not hard to hang on to the beer bottles. Get them to go down to a local homebrew and pick up some stuff. Say, cost it all out, get them to pay for it. Then you go down, you pick up your, if you're making beer, you pick up your dextrose, your grains, or, if you want to make it from a kit and kilo, then you go and buy, buy your kit, whatever kit they want, whatever adjuncts and things you want to put into it. Cost it all out to them, give it to them. It's not going to cost a lot. If somebody gives you 25 quid, that should basically cover one brew easily. It'll cover the actual kit and kilo and hopefully bottle tops. There you go. And that way, nobody's actually broken the law, because what they've done is they have simply paid for the tools for you to make a homebrew, and then you give it to them. Now, that way, that's probably the best thing to do. You certainly don't want to end up getting under sticky wickets with legal problems over homebrew. It's a bad idea. I mean, if you do have a premises, if you've got a big, massive garage with water and electricity and you're doing nothing with it and you've cleaned it all out inside and it's lovely and bright and clean and could be used as a home brewing plant, sure, look into it. Think of it as a second job. If you love making home brew, yeah, you could do it as a weekend job. Take stuff down the local market and sell it. Now, yeah, that's entirely simple, entirely possible. I'll put some links in the thing below, just about to where you can find information on that kind of thing, if that is of interest. But I would say for the most part, for your average home brewer, don't bother trying to make money off this. It's not worth the effort. Just have some fun. Make some beer, make some wine, make some Melomel. Make anything else you fancy. You don't even have to go through all the effort of home brewing to the kind of extent that I do. As somebody was mentioning to me on Facebook the other day, well, they make sloe gin. All you need for that is, some sloe breeze, and some gin, and some sugar. Dead simple. You don't have to go to all the effort. But anyway, that's about enough for today. I hope everyone's enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon. Happy Homebrew Wednesday.